All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming to the Understanding Racial Injustice Speaker Series event presented by We Charity Minnesota, the SARI youth group of the Indian Association of Minnesota. My name is Ronak Pandey and I will be the moderator for today's event. So taking into consideration recent events as allies, our organizations believe it is important to educate our local community members about racial injustices amongst the Black and African American communities. The SARI Youth Group, which stands for South Asians Against Racial Injustice, was created to find ways to engage our community to inform, educate, engage, and advocate for social and racial change in our society by leveraging the IAM platform. Our purpose with this series of events is to educate ourselves on topics such as the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, covert and institutional racism, and ultimately on how to become an effective ally for all Black lives. This is the second event of our four-part speaker series, and our topic today will be institutional racism and covert racism in our society. Our guest speakers tonight are Josh Crosson and Dr.Nekima Levy-Armstrong. If you would like to ask a question to either speaker for the question and answer session at the end, please do so using the link in the chat. And without further ado, let's get into the first presentation of the day. So our first esteemed speaker of the day is Josh Crosson. Josh Crosson is the executive director at Ed Allies, a nonprofit organization in Minneapolis dedicated to ensuring that every young Minnesotan has access to a rigorous and engaging education. As the executive director, Josh sets the direction for the organization's work to ensure that every Minnesota student has access to a great education. He previously worked in DC, where he transformed his passion for public policy into a fulfilling vocation at the Human Rights Campaign, and later on Capitol Hill. At HRC, Josh spearheaded student outreach operations and expanded the organization's mission to incorporate LGBTQ students from historically Black colleges and universities. He then spent 4 years writing legislation and advising his hometown congressman, Representative Adam Smith, on labor, health, budget, and tax issues. Please welcome Josh Crosson.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me today. This is such a pleasure to be able to speak with people who are taking up their beautiful Tuesday night to talk about racism in society and what more we could do to address it. As was stated in my introduction, I recently come from Washington D.C. or originally come from the Seattle area, but by way of Washington D.C., where I was very much engaged and indignant about the state of our country and how we can best eradicate sexism, homophobia, and racism from the world. And so my levers of change were direct advocacy, as well as thinking about other opportunities to do that. So working as the labor legislative aide for my congressman, also working in healthcare during the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Coming to Minnesota after meeting my now husband, who brought me to the state, I thought, education, who could disagree about education? It doesn't really feel like that's much of a lever to address racism in society. Little did I know, coming into the state of Minnesota was a hotbed of issues related to race and racism in the education sector. So I was quick to learn that our entire country is founded on the premise of whiteness and white supremacy. And so education and every other sector in this country is not exempt from what that means. So at Ed Allies, we are an education, and you can go to the next slide here. Our vision at Ed Allies is we envision a Minnesota where every student succeeds in a rigorous and engaging school and opportunity. And love to tell you a little bit more about that, what that means, and how kids are not currently receiving a rigorous and engaging school. So if you go to the next slide. So a little bit about me, go to slide 4. That's me as a baby, right? As little Josh. The woman on the left is my mother. She's a Filipino immigrant, came to this country at the age of 6 with her siblings and her parents. and met my dad, who's on the right, who is in the military, Sergeant Crosson. They both went to a high school that I was destined to go to when I was born, that had a 17% high school graduation rate when I was ready to go there. My mom and dad barely graduated high school. They both were able to graduate high school, and both became products of their society. And I was destined for that same life until my mom's boss at the time said, there might be a better opportunity for Josh out there. Maybe he shouldn't be going to the same high school that you went to. The statistics don't look great. Maybe there's something better. So my mom worked 3 jobs to put me through a private school that was about a 30-minute drive down the street from our place. So a 30-minute drive back there and 30-minute drive back. Herculean effort to give me a good opportunity. I graduated with people that I'm now calling lawyers and doctors. I was the only Black male in my class to graduate from that high school. The high school I was supposed to go to, some folks are doing okay, but for the most part, people are in low-wage jobs. Some are in jail or in prison. And it's not that one high school had smarter people or they worked harder. It was that we were born into the opportunities that we were given, and our destinies were kind of signed by our birth, by our zip code, by the melanin in our skin. And our systems are designed in a way for some people to succeed and some people to fail. And so often that line is drawn by race. So if you go to the next slide, after growing up, I went to Santa Clara University in California, where I'm kind of telling my age here, every Friday, sometimes missing class and going to protest the Iraq War. So I was a very indignant person. And I wanted to kind of harness my indignation into something in a fulfilling vocation, which I'm currently doing with Ed Allies. So I'm going to have you skip, go to next slide, and then next slide. This is like an hour-long presentation that I want to squeeze into just 15 minutes of introduction here, and then open it up for questions. But one thing I'd love folks to think about is the idea of equity. And so the definition of equity, to me, is understanding the historic and systemic disparities and opportunities and outcomes. So understanding our history and how we got here, and then providing resources to the necessary to necessarily address those disparities. So it's one thing to say, okay, well, we need to approach this issue in an equitable way, but if you don't understand the history behind that or how we got to the places that we are, you can often do more harm than good in addressing something where you think that you're addressing racism or white supremacy, and by not understanding that history, you might be perpetuating white supremacy. And in the same way, if you only think about the history or only talk about all of the harms and the single story narratives of a society without actually doing anything to address that further, it could continue to harm societies and continue white supremacy. We see this a lot in education, where people will say, well, those people over there, they're poor, or they don't have books at home, or there are bullets going through their windows, or all of these like negative deficit-based thinking of communities, and then therefore we shouldn't do anything to address how we have manifested racism in society. That actually does a lot of harm for communities if you're only seeing them in a certain light, but then not addressing that. So that's kind of one example of how we can talk about history or talk about systemic disparities, but actually not doing anything about it. Now, if you go to the next slide. So in Minnesota, next slide here. Yeah, great. So in Minnesota, this is just some basic stats where we're dealing with in Minnesota schools. So about 2 out of 5 of our students are low income in the state of Minnesota. That's about 3 out of 5 in Minneapolis, or the Twin Cities specifically. About 1 out of 3 students are people of color or Native American students in the state of Minnesota. In the Twin Cities, that's about 2 out of 3. About 10% of our students are English language learners. That's double in the Twin Cities. And 1% of our students are homeless or highly mobile. In the Twin Cities, that's about 8% of our students are homeless and highly mobile. If you could skip through the next 2 slides. All right, one more. One of the ideas that Ed Allies is really focusing on is in addressing racial disparities in schools, is addressing the disparities or makeup of student or of educators. Minnesota has about 4% teachers of color. We are only beat out by North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. And why this is important is research study after study shows that students with educators of color, specifically students with Black or Hispanic educators, are more likely to graduate high school, attend a rigorous college or university, and less likely to be suspended and expelled from their school, from their K-12 education. So there is no single magic bullet to address racism in education, but there is a close one, and that's increasing teachers of color. And as you can see here, Minnesota is far behind the rest of the country when it comes to educators of color. Minneapolis has fewer teachers of color. This is actually the case for the Twin Cities generally, fewer teachers of color than the United States, but more students of color than the United States. So there's a giant gap with students of color and the teachers that serve them. And you go to the next slide. I also broke that down by API and non-API educators. I've done this presentation before with the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, and showing that API teachers are also well underrepresented in our schools, which has impacts for students where model minority myths are also very damaging to students as well. So I'm going to have you skip by 3 slides. And we can talk a little bit more about what I think is working in Minnesota and what's not working in Minnesota. But I wanted to address race-based gaps in our state. And when we talk about racism in Minnesota, we can't talk about racism without talking about student outcomes, talking about outcomes for communities. So where we put our the saying, put your money where your mouth is, we can talk all day long, and a lot of people do talk about how racist our society is, how we can address anti-Black violence, can put a sign on your lawn. But when it comes down to it, and when students are not being served well and families are not being served well, it comes out in the data. And this is just one such piece of data here, where, as you can see, the bar on the left, the blue bar, is white student proficiency. So I broke this down between Minnesota and Minneapolis in math and reading. And as you can see in all variables, that white students are actually outperforming all students. But I think one of the clearest aha things I see here is that yellow bar right in the middle, that shows low income student proficiency. All of the bars to the right of the yellow bar, with the exception of Latinx students in Minneapolis in their reading, but every other bar to the right of low income learners are students of color, I should say non-Asian students of color. So Latinx, Black, Native American, also includes special education and English language learners in there as well. But it's this what I see in this narrative is low-income learners are outperforming, by and large, students of color in the state of Minnesota. I actually broke down the data even further and saw that homeless white students, while they have a swath of needs among homeless and highly mobile white students, are actually outperforming Black and Native American students in the state of Minnesota. And what that means, if you go down one more slide, and I just want to mention this too, because I'm doing a lot with data disaggregation and breaking down student achievement among API communities as well. And here's kind of just one of those. As you can see, the yellow bar on the very right are Black student achievement, and then near that is Native American and Hispanic. But as you can see below, Burmese students and even Hmong students are low performing in the state. So we can't just talk about Asian Pacific Islander communities as a whole. We also have to break that down and show that the disparities also exist clearly among Southeast Asian communities. But, and then I'll wrap up here, but if you can go down to 2 more slides. There you go. What this all means, right? So with our current reading proficiency, I often get the question, is Minnesota any different from the rest of the country? Or what does this mean in closing achievement gaps? Based on the data, purely based on the data, Minnesota Black students won't meet where white students are reading until 2102, meaning the same number of students who are proficient who are white, that will not be met by Black students currently until 2102. For reading for Hispanic students, that's going to be until 2073. And Minnesota students of color will never, if we project out the data, Minnesota students of color will never meet where white students are in math, because proficiency in math is going down every single year. So the outcomes for students of color are decreasing or staying pretty steady, where we know literacy rates are matched with prison incarceration rates, with homelessness rates. So when we get students young and we're not educating them well, we're keeping them back, it only projects to lifelong lack of achievement. And then the last slide I'll go to before I hand it over to Nekima here, and one more slide, if you go one slide. There you go. Last slide I'll mention is we are an outlier in this country, and not in a good way. So in Minnesota, our Black students are rated 43rd out of 48th in the country, our fourth grade students in reading. So basically in any other state in the country, you'd be doing better if you were a Black student in fourth grade. For Asian students, that we're 28th out of 32 in the country for eighth grade math. And then for our high school graduation rates, we're last place. We are dead last for Black and Latinx students. And for Asian and Asian Pacific Islander students and Native American students, we're second to last place. So again, in any other state in the country, you would fare better as a person of color than you would here in the state of Minnesota. I gave you a lot of data, a lot of things to kind of think about. Love to have a more robust conversation in the question and answer period. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that educational presentation. Like he's just said, if you guys have any questions for Josh, please ask in the Google form link in the chat, and then we'll get to those in the question and answer session at the end of our program. And please consider donating to Mr. Crosson's organization at Allies or Black Men Teach. The links to donate to these groups are going to be sent in the chat. And with that, our next esteemed guest speaker is Dr. Nekima Levy Armstrong. Nekima is a renowned civil rights attorney activist and executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to building a national network of place-based activists who win battles for justice. This group invests in women and girls, empowering community activism as a result. Nekima was a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis from 2003 to 2016, and previously served as the president of the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP. She is the author of several articles and essays focused on racial justice, poverty, incarceration, and the war on drugs. Her work has been featured in the Associated Press, The Crisis Magazine, Huffington Post, and the Star Tribune, to name a few. She has also appeared on national news outlets such as CNN, PBS, Al Jazeera America, News One, and Democracy Now! Nekima is also the founder of the Racial Justice Network, a cutting-edge grassroots organization that she founded in 2018 to address racial discrimination in education, criminal justice, and economic justice. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Armstrong.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today for this important conversation surrounding institutionalized racism and covert racism. I think that Josh did a fantastic job of laying out what institutional racism looks like in the state of Minnesota within our public education system. Many of us hear these data points on a regular basis, and we're often frustrated because we don't see enough being done to address the systemic racism that leads to many of these devastating outcomes. So I want to talk about a topic that I think is very much related to the public education system, and that is the system of criminal justice in the state of Minnesota and nationally. Many of us are very focused on what's happening in criminal justice because of the recent murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. We're focusing a lot on policing, but policing ties directly into the system of mass incarceration. The two go hand in hand. So I want to dial it back a little bit and kind of give some information about the roots of our criminal justice system here and how we got to the place where someone like George Floyd, a normal African-American man, could be placed in a position in which the world is watching a white officer with his knee on his neck for nearly 8 minutes, some say nearly 9 minutes. But either way, it was a very horrific circumstance that we all saw and that we are all haunted by. So in terms of thinking about this from an institutional racism perspective, it's important to understand that the criminal justice system is rooted in systemic racism. We know that there is a history of slavery of Black people in this country that lasted for hundreds of years. And prior to the so-called abolishment of slavery, the criminal justice system in the country was filled primarily with poor white men, working class white men, white male laborers, et cetera. But once slavery was abolished, what we saw happening was many states, especially Southern states, changing their laws on the books to make standard behavior by Black men a crime. So if a Black man was hanging out late at night, the laws were changed to make that a crime. If they were unemployed, if they were talking too loud, if they were spitting on the sidewalk, those things became crimes. So they were written into law. And once something is written into law, that gives other state actors the power to enforce the law. And so those changes to the law allowed Southern white sheriffs to come into Black communities and round up Black men for violating those so-called laws. And once those men were being arrested, they were likely being tried by all white juries, another form of systemic racism in terms of the system being able to determine what your jury pool looks like. A lot of times there were literacy tests in place so that if you could not read, you could not serve on a jury. There were also laws in place that prevented Black people from serving on a jury. So again, that is a form of institutionalized racism that was built into the system and which many people did not question. White people didn't question the system, they participated in it, and Black people didn't have the legal standing to even question those particular systems. And so when Black men would be brought into these systems, tried by all white juries, most of the time they were found guilty. They would be sentenced to 10, 15, 20 years in prison. For many of these men, those were life sentences because of the horrible conditions under which they had to work. So there were mining companies, for example, causing prisoners to engage in back-breaking and very dangerous labor. There were railroad companies and other types of corporations that were forcing prisoners to engage, again, in back-breaking dangerous labor, and the state profited off of this inmate labor, right? So think about what a setup that is. You have folks who've been enslaved from one generation to the next, who by law couldn't learn to read or write, who by law were not paid for their labor, families forced to birth children in the midst of slavery. I mean, the list goes on and on. No access to land, property. And then once the law changes to allow people to be free, you suddenly see a new form of enslavement through the criminal justice system being brought forward with those laws that I mentioned earlier, and with corporations profiting off of this inmate labor, along with the state able to charge these companies for the free labor of the men who were incarcerated. And so those are the origins of our criminal justice system. And those laws that were put on the books were called the Black Codes. In Minneapolis, we've had our own version of the Black Codes. We have had laws on the books that made it a crime for people to spit on the sidewalk, or made it a crime for people to lurk. And, you know, to this day, no one can really give you a definition of lurking other than someone standing around. So think about when laws are written and they're ambiguous and they're meant to target certain populations. That means that those with the power to enforce the law have so much authority in terms of deciding who they actually arrest for those crimes. So in the city of Minneapolis, up until 2015, those laws against spitting and lurking were being inequitably enforced against young Black men. So in other words, white joggers can run through Minneapolis spitting on the sidewalk and not be charged with spitting. Young Black man standing on the corner, spits on the sidewalk, suddenly given a citation. And then those citations open the door to more criminal justice involvement, where someone either has to pay a fine in furtherance of addressing that criminal justice violation. Sometimes they have to deal with an arrest record. Sometimes they have to deal with an actual criminal justice record, which then may open the door to being denied access to jobs or housing. So I wanted to provide that as an illustration as to how those who are in positions to make decisions can actually set up an entire system that relegates people to second and third class citizenship, as we've seen with the criminal justice system. And as if that is not enough, Black people were suffering already under the weight of oppression through the system of mass incarceration. We saw Congress put in place something known as the war on drugs. I spent a number of years researching the war on drugs when I was a law professor, looking at the impact specifically to the Black and Latinx community, adults as well as children, and looking at the impacts upon women, Black and Latinx women, who were the fastest growing segment of the prison population, and they still are. And so when Congress put in place the war on drugs, they initially started out in the 70s, where the war on drugs actually became a war on poor Black and brown bodies. And again, just as in the previous illustration, Congress put laws in place where they didn't have any hearings, they didn't have any expert testimony. They just played off of a media frenzy surrounding drugs flooding into poor Black and brown communities. And they put some of the harshest laws we've ever had on the books to give them a justification for imprisoning Black and brown people for 10, 20, 30, 40 years at a time, and sometimes life. We have to remember that there are, again, economic ramifications to that type of systemic racism that led to our prison population going from about 500,000 people in 1980, doubling that to 1 million in 1990. And then again, going to 2 million in 2000. And now we're at roughly 2.3 million people incarcerated, with at least another 7 million on some form of probation or supervised release. And that doesn't include all of the juveniles who are caught up in the system. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 5% of the world's population, but over 20% of the world's prisoners. So we have to understand that there is an entire system that's been constructed around institutionalized racism, around systemic racism, around covert racism, to the point where it is imperceptible to the average person. We just take it as par for the course that young Black men are going to be brought into the criminal justice system. We've been indoctrinated through the media, through movies, through television shows, where we see white police officers arresting Black men, and we began to be conditioned to see that as a normal thing that happens within our society, not really realizing that this is a relic of slavery, and this is an intentional way of continuing to marginalize and oppress Black and brown people in this country. And in order to maintain such a large system of mass incarceration that, again, is tied to economics because of the trillions of dollars that are spent that have been spent on criminal justice over the years, the corporations that benefit, the fact that prison stocks are being traded on Wall Street. I've gone into prisons. I've seen prisoners packaging Sesame Street toys for Target. They're not the only company that uses prison labor, but won't hire people who are coming out of the criminal justice system who have criminal records to work in their stores. When you think about the impacts of all of that, it's easy to understand how what we saw on May 25th that happened to George Floyd actually happened. You need police officers in order to help fuel a system of mass incarceration. And most of the time when we're thinking about police officers, the larger mainstream community is taught that police officers are friendly, that they're supportive, that they're there to help, but that is not the experience in most Black and brown communities and amongst many low-income people and people with mental health issues. We know that police are there patrolling our communities really to contain us within certain communities, and also to monitor people's behavior, standard behavior like spitting, like people having disagreements, like someone going into a store and having an issue with a store owner, and the next thing you know, they are on the ground having their life snuffed out of them. In order to maintain this kind of system, you have to have police officers who, under the cover of law, are able to go into these communities. They're able to enforce the law, and they decide who is given a citation, who is given a pat on the back or a handshake from Officer Friendly, and who's placed in handcuffs and being brought into the system. That's exactly what those Minneapolis officers were trying to do to George Floyd. And we have to beg the question of how did we as a society get to a place where we have condoned institutional racism, where we have condoned systemic racism through our silence and our failure to raise questions, as we're starting to see a ballooning prison population, as we're starting to see more police officers on the streets, as we're starting to see more police officers in our schools, and as we're starting to see a normalization of the criminalization of Black and brown bodies. So hopefully that can give people a glimpse into what systemic racism looks like. And I think that the criminal justice system is the twin system to public education in terms of the ways in which these systems are used to contain, used to control, used to marginalize, and punish those who are in Black and brown skin, rather than allowing us the opportunity to live free, to breathe free, and to die free. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong, for such an informative speech. I know this is serving as an excellent learning opportunity about the criminal justice system for all of us. Please consider donating to the Racial Justice Network. The link to donate to this group is going to be sent in the chat. And our next segment will be a panel-style question-answer session. We will be using the questions sent through the Google Forms to ask the speakers. So are the speakers ready? So the first question is, what does API stand for? And that's for Mr. Crosson.
Yeah, so I'm sorry for not clarifying that further. API stands for Asian Pacific Islander. Sorry about the acronyms, it comes so quickly. Asian Pacific Islander, and that embodies a large group of individuals. I'm Filipino as well as Black. So Philippines, Hmong, Lao, Cambodian, South Asian, Burmese, et cetera, et cetera. So very diverse group is Asian Pacific Islander.
Then the next question is, how do we address white supremacy in schools when students of color and teachers of color are not treated well and underrepresented? And that's also for Mr. Crosson.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I kind of gave the negatives of it, right? Of the outcomes for students of color and communities of color. And I think there are a few ways to address disparities and specifically white supremacy in school. And I think the first way is believing that there's a problem, and then addressing the problem with a sense of urgency. I think so few people actually believe that there's a problem in our Minnesota education system, where they believe that certain students can just never succeed because of the color of their skin, because of their zip code. They'll never be able to make it. And I think that's just kind of a wrong-headed approach, and we'll never be able to solve a solution if the overwhelming number of people believe that no problem actually exists. I think the second way to do this is addressing and providing resources and understanding our history in an equitable way. So in Minnesota, we are very good. We're tied for number one in terms of how much money we provide for schools, but near the end for students of color in particular. So where funding is appropriate, we're still not being able to provide learning opportunities, great educators, cultural knowledge. I've gone through my entire learning probably not ever reading or having an educator of color or reading about my own personal experiences or seeing somebody who looked like me in my textbooks, right? So while funding is necessary, I think it's also important to say that students and families need to be culturally celebrated and welcomed into their school atmosphere and heard and honored, right? So the choice of families, the choice of parents, that needs to be valued and honored as well. And then the last thing I'll say is accountability for our education system. If our system isn't working well for students of color, hiding in shame or being nice about it is not helping the problem or the situation. I think we need to address the problems head on, and that needs to be done through a community-based effort where we need to create multiple measurements of accountability so that parents and communities of color can ensure that their schools are serving their students well.
Thank you.
If I can chime in as well real quick.
Go
I
ahead.
think that one of the things that's also important, just to add to what Josh is saying, is that we have to be willing to call a spade a spade. A lot of times we use flowery language like diversity, equity, inclusion, when we need to be talking about racism and white supremacy and the role that it is playing in the perpetuation of inadequate educational opportunities for our Black and brown students. There's also a great deal of anti-Blackness that plays a role in terms of how our Black students are treated in schools, being pushed out of classrooms, being brought into the juvenile justice system at a young age, or being told that they are intellectually inferior. A lot of that is tied to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. It hasn't been acknowledged, and even who produces our textbooks for our kids, mostly companies in Texas that lack any cultural competency, that lack an understanding of anti-racism, they are pushing out propaganda that is perpetuating the educational inequities that our kids are experiencing. We also, like Josh said about accountability, every white educator needs to be holding themselves accountable for how they show up in the classroom, what they teach kids, how they supplement, how they treat parents and students. And also asking the question, am I the right person to be in this classroom if there's a room full of Black and brown kids and I have no connection to these kids' culture, their community, their language, etc. So people have to start asking some hard questions and doing the hard work of opening doors for Black and brown educators who belong in front of the classroom and not just in the behavioral intervention rooms.
I'll just color this a little bit too. Just imagine a world where 95% of all teachers were teachers of color, right? They were Black, they're Asian, Pacific Islander, they're Latinx, and we only had 4% of educators are white. And in that same world, 70% of all people of color can read and do math at grade level, 70%. But in that same world, only 30% of white students could read and do math at grade level. If this world existed, the systems of white supremacy would burn this world to the ground, right? We would start from scratch. We would fire every single educator. We would say, shame on you for letting the system happen that is perpetuating racism and violence and oppression on an entire community. And you're starting with our children. Shame on you. That's where we currently are right now for kids of color and for the white-led institutions of education. I had a chance to ask, our commissioner recently. I said, if the economy is going down and layoffs might have to happen in schools. I hope they don't, but layoffs might have to happen. Can I get your commitment right now that you will protect teachers of color if layoffs have to happen in schools? I cannot get a single commitment from a policymaker that they will protect educators of color if layoffs were to happen tomorrow. That's a problem. So while we talk a lot, like Nekima said, while we talk all of this flowery language about how we honor anti-racism, how we need to dismantle white supremacy. And I bring up an issue like, if layoffs happen tomorrow, will you put your name on a piece of legislation to protect teachers of color? And you can't do it. That's kind of where we are right now in terms of just calling a spade a spade.
The next question is for Nekima, and it is, since capitalism is heavily intertwined with and benefits from institutional racism, how can we help dismantle the system?
Well, I would say that's definitely a loaded question. It's a good question, but I think the best example that I can think of really is what Dr. King talked about in 1967 with his Poor People's Campaign that he wanted to launch in Washington, D.C. in April of 1968. He talked about a basic guaranteed income for all Americans, so that people would have access to just basic resources at a minimum to be able to provide for their families, along with universal health care, housing as well. I think that those things are the bare minimum of what people should be provided. And a lot of people scoff at the idea. So even for those people who have a problem with capitalism, most of the folks even watching who consider themselves to be progressive are not willing to give up what they have access to in order to help level the playing field for those who don't have enough, those who are experiencing homelessness, those who are unemployed. So we're going to have to open up our hands and be willing to relinquish some of the resources that we have. And in particular, white America is going to have to open up their hands, their pocketbooks, the land they've stolen, and everything else in order to actually begin to level the playing field. Beyond that, Black people are still owed reparations. Unapologetically, I'm saying that, even though, again, people scoff at the idea. Everyone else has virtually been provided with reparations. And this is a debt that's actually owed to Black people. We're not asking for something that does not belong to us. We're asking for something that's owed. And that alone would help alleviate a lot of the problems that we experience in the Black community.
And the next question is, how do you recommend non-Black POC should involve themselves in activism? And this is for the both of you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the worst person to ask a how-to question because I'm always just say, just do it. The first thing I'll say is I think we people of color understand what it means and feels like to be marginalized, to not be listened to not have our experiences validated. And I think that's the same situation for Black liberation in your own right? I kind of live in two worlds, being Filipino and Black, and with my Black family, like, we get it, like, we understand what it means to walk down the street and be Black and have those stories validated. And my Filipino side, there's a lot more education that has to go on for my family to kind of feel like they could step up and say, okay, I'll be anti-Black too. But I think for all people who aren't Black and who are fighting for liberation, or who aren't, whatever community and are fighting for the liberation of that community, the first thing to do is take a seat, listen, and follow. I recently saw a meme that said, it said like, white people, like, what can we do to help? And then it was like, Black people, just listen to us. And then it said, white people, that sounds hard. Anything else? Right. So just, I think the first step is just to take a step back, listen before doing anything. Because again, like I said, doing things without understanding the history can be harmful to the community.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say that non-Black people of color also should understand that they usually have a certain degree of anti-Blackness embedded within, that they have to work to deconstruct and dismantle, because they can show up and be just as harmful as a white person, if not more so, because we're thinking that this person has an understanding based on having a hue, to their skin, having some type of tone, that they have an understanding of discrimination, but it's not quite the same because of the history of anti-Blackness that happens here, and because of non-Black peoples of color ability to wield anti-Blackness as a weapon. There's also the notion that many non-Black people of color sometimes work really hard to fit into white society. And there's the myth of the model minority, and those things can be barriers. Buying into those myths and trying to appear harmless to white people while doing harm to yourself and harm to others as a result. So folks have to show up understanding that history, understanding where they're at on a personal level, what they've been taught, work to deconstruct that, and then, like Josh said, actually listen and learn. And then as you ask, how can I be helpful? And people respond, actually walking in humility and then responding accordingly. And I think even as Black people, we appreciate when people show up, when they're humble, when they're listening, and when they're figuring out, what is the best way that I can be helpful, and understanding you're probably going to make mistakes, but not, running off and seeing that as the end of the world, but learning from those mistakes and then showing up again and again and again until you feel ready to take it to the next level.
All right, then the next question is also for the both of you. It is, what are your thoughts on the Powdered Horn neighborhood? Do you feel that if more neighborhoods did the same thing, we could get help? We could help get rid of the need of excessive policing of marginalized communities.
Well, I don't think that the Powderhorn neighborhood burned down their police station or the buildings. I honestly don't think that. I think that there were a lot of folks engaged, but most of the buildings across the Twin Cities were likely burned down by white people. At least that's the way it seems from the media reports that we're seeing. We're still waiting, but from folks who they put out arrest warrants for so far, we've seen white folks. We also saw suspicious white men on video cutting glass of stores that were later burned. So there are a lot of dynamics there. So I don't think the Powderhorn community itself was responsible for a lot of the damage that was done. I think that this is a problem, is the use of excessive force that has plagued the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota for decades. I think that in the aftermath of the horrific death of George Floyd, that some people just got to the point where they just couldn't take it anymore and they wanted to send a signal that something needed to change. And unfortunately, as Dr. King once said, a riot is the language of the unheard. If folks had a seat at the table, if their voices were being listened to, if they felt respected, if they were treated with dignity, you would never have people out in the streets in the first place marching and protesting. But it has come to that because the powers that be will not listen to us. Mainstream Minnesotans who are comfortable will not listen to us. And so we have to keep showing up and keep demonstrating and keep demanding justice. And then of course, Powderhorn, like many parts of the Twin Cities, there are areas that need to be rebuilt as a result of what happened.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add to that is kind of the opposite side of people needing to be heard or people of color being historically marginalized or oppressed, is that the oppressors often feel like they're under attack. Where a lot of the narrative too was like, people of color are burning the city down. And as Nekima said, there's a lot more to that story. But also the narrative didn't include, police officers like stabbing tires of people or indiscriminately pepper spraying people or indiscriminately shooting people with rubber bullets. Like it was controversial to talk about systems in that way. And the reason why I bring that up is when people who are historically marginalized, they're often labeled as the enemy, whereas the systems are often labeled as the hero. And in everything that we work in, whether that's criminal justice or in education, is to really understand how the system can be very detrimental to people and how taking a stand is going to be very difficult. You will be labeled as an enemy. You will be, right? Like Nekima and I are dragged through the mud because of the work that we do. It's not easy, and being an ally is not easy because you're going against these historical systems that have systematically oppressed people. and their narrative and the work of the status quo is strong. So that's just the one thing that I'll add is what we often didn't hear is the system's retaliation, and that's on purpose. And so any fight that you do is going to have retaliation from the system, and you're not going to look good at the end of it. But it'll make a better society for the future generation.
Absolutely. So just to Josh's point, for folks who are interested in being activists and engaging in this work, don't go in expecting that people are going to like you, that they're going to want to hear what you have to say, but show up anyway, speak anyway, demand justice anyway. That's what the people who have come before us had to do. So we can't expect that the path is any easier when society is even more deeply entrenched in these injustices that have been created. You really have to develop a thick skin if you don't have one. And then you have to remind yourself, why am I doing this? What is it that drives me? What drives my work? So that you can be persistent in the midst of the adversity and the exclusion and the isolation and everything else that you'll experience by going against the grain and fighting against the status quo. But I think in the end, it's worth it because we know that we're standing on the right side of history.
Yes.
And the next question is for Mr. Crosson. This is a question from a white educator in Brooklyn. What advice would you give to white educators teaching to predominantly POC students on how to be a better ally/educator? It can be hard to know what to do tangibly on a day-to-day basis versus protesting and donating.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say the first thing is to understand your own privilege and how you became an educator. I love the book by Dr. Beverly Tatum, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? Really understanding why students of color, in particular Black students, have a shared narrative or have a shared understanding of how educators have treated them, how school systems have treated them. Understanding really your own privilege and speaking out on that privilege, right? Like nearly all of our teachers are white. If we are able to shift an education system, it would be through our educators. And I say this kind of as a defeatist, right? Like our Democratic Party, both in the state of Minnesota and throughout the country, sees it as an existential issue to support the needs and the interests of our teachers union. And our teachers union is made up of educators. And so if our teachers union is not fighting for race equity within the profession or for students of color, then the Democratic Party won't be fighting for those things. So in order to actually move or shift one of the most powerful levers in American society, which is an entire political party, I think it's incumbent on white teachers to kind of step up and say, leadership of our union, you are endorsing all of these candidates who are not doing enough for communities and people of color. Leadership within our union, you're not doing enough to protect teachers of color or students of color. You're not doing enough to make sure that students of color aren't being suspended and expelled. You're not doing enough to make sure that communities of color are thriving. So using your own power as an educator, and you have a lot of power as an educator, but using your own power as an educator and your own power as a white person in order to motivate society to change for your students of color, I think is going to do tremendously. As a Black person who's gone through the education system, I think the teachers that I connected with the most are those teachers who had high expectations for me, who didn't let me fail, who made sure that I knew how to write an essay and read that text and learn that equation at the end of the day, and who didn't discount my experience as being from a single mother household, from a low income household, as a way to give up on me. So on a very personal level, I would just say that educators, keep your expectations high for your students, because each and every one of your students, even though it doesn't feel like they can, but each and every one of your students can succeed.
Then our next question is for the both of you. It is, how can we include more people of color in areas that are predominantly white due to systemic racism? For example, the justice and education systems.
Well, I think that part of it, as I mentioned before, white people are going to have to take a stand, and sometimes they're going to have to get out of the way if they are occupying space that should be reserved for people of color, given the historical and systemic racism and discrimination. It has never been a level playing field. So the systems that got so many white people into teaching are a part of the problem, because there are mechanisms that are put in place that are barriers to Black and brown people and Native people and Asian people from being able to get their foot in the door and to get access to those teaching positions. So white people have a great responsibility. Most are passing the buck. That's part of the problem. The burden shouldn't fall on Black and brown people, but it often does. And we take a lot of risk and we face retaliation, but it's necessary to do in order to open the doors for yourself and for others. So we're going to have to become more bold. We're going to have to become more outspoken and more strategic and more focused on accomplishing a shift in terms of what our teaching core looks like. And we're going to have to hold people accountable who are a part of the problem and posing barriers to change.
Right. Sorry, can you say the question again? Was it specifically on education or?
It was the justice system and education systems.
Okay, so how to introduce? Yeah, I mean, specifically for education and how to increase teachers of color, Nekima, I think you said it clear as day. The systems that exist are the reason why we got to this place, and it's not an accident. We have 96% white educators, and that's not on accident. One of Brown v. Board of Education that dismantled segregated schools is by and large valued and favored as a society, but we often forget that when we integrated schools, we got rid of Black schools and we got rid of Black educators. And in order for students to feel self-determined, they went and sought out those communities. So in Minnesota in particular, students of color are going to seek out the communities that are serving them well. Now, I think there's a lot of motivation to, by policy, get rid of those schools that are serving kids of color well and replacing it with kind of white-led institutions again. And likewise with licensure, Minnesota is the whitest teaching cohort in the nation, but we don't let educators from outside of the state come into the state of Minnesota until very, very recently. And so we are blocking Black teachers who are coming mostly from historically Black colleges and universities, and other educators of color coming from minority serving institutes from coming into the profession. I sit in the our licensing agency meetings constantly, the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board, and every single meeting, they are telling schools, you cannot hire that teacher of color because of the level of their license. You must hire that white teacher. And I don't care if you're the principal and you know what's best for your students, you cannot hire that teacher of color, you must hire that white teacher. And that's because of the laws and the practices that we set up. So what I'll say is, just in summary, is looking at every single rule, looking at every single practice through an equity lens and saying, how is that going to benefit communities of color? Challenging your own, perceptions and challenging your own kind of like your own personal bias, and really thinking like critically, is that going to serve communities of color well for everything?
Yeah. And I would just add to that real quick that it's important to interrogate every system that is built on white supremacy and not take it for granted. And part of how you interrogate it is by looking at the outcomes. What should this system look like, and what does it look like, and how is it impacting the people that it's supposed to serve? And then who is it benefiting? And that'll tell you what you need to know in terms of what needs to change. And most of the time, people know what needs to change, but they don't have the political will or the courage to do what needs to be done. Because that means that someone is going to have to get out of the way in order to change that outcome. And I say, so be it. Get out of the way.
So that was actually our last question because we are going over time. So I just wanted to thank everyone for their questions, and sorry if we weren't able to get to yours, but like I just said, we're over time right now, so we got to wrap it up. We would like to end tonight with some thank yous and a call to action. So to start, we would like to thank everyone in IAM, the Sorry Youth Group, and We Charity Minnesota who helped us organize this event. Next, and most importantly, we would like to thank our esteemed speakers, Josh Crosson and Dr. Nekima Levy-Armstrong, for taking time out of your busy schedules to educate us on such a vital topic. Last but definitely not least, we would like to thank all of you for attending this event. We really hope you were able to take something away from it, and we will be having 2 more events just like this one on different topics, and we really hope you all can make it to those as well. We will be sending out a post-event survey so that we can get feedback on this event and improve it for the next time. So please do fill that out. And next week, we will be having Neeraj Rajasekar and Dr. Suraj Yengde to speak about the similarities between systemic racism in the United States and casteism in India. This speaker series will take place at the same time, 7 p.m. CST, next Tuesday with the same Zoom link. And with that said, thank you all so much once again, and